This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Saley. When Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in October of 1973, Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford became the first person to be appointed Vice President of the United States using the rules of the 25th Amendment. And when President Nixon resigned just a year later, Ford would become the first person to become President of the United States, never having been elected as either President or Vice President. Ford inherited a nation that was disheartened by the Watergate scandal, still dealing with the final throes of the war in Vietnam and facing difficult issues and extremist politics, both at home and abroad. And Ford would also face the barrel of a gun, not once, but twice, in 2 weeks. The 1975 assassination attempts on President Gerald Ford were perhaps indicative of the tumultuous times. Many of you know that I spent the month of June in Europe with fans of The History Guy. If traveling with The History Guy sounds like fun to you, there's still a few spots left in a trip to Ireland next June. I'll put a link in the description. But while I had a really good time, met a lot of really good people, my problem was that I was using my telephone carrier's international plan, and I just didn't always have reliable internet, and that was inconvenient sometimes, but it was really a problem when I lost navigation, ended up on one of these European back roads. It's like a narrow road that looks like something out of Children of the Corn, and also, my international plan was just kind of expensive. So what I didn't have, and which I really wished that I had known about at the time, was Saley. Inside your phone, there's a thing called a SIM card. You've probably heard of that. If you didn't know, SIM stands for Subscriber Identity Module, but that's essentially the thing in your phone that says who you are and tells your carrier that you have access to that carrier network. And if you remember back in the day, like a decade ago, when you travel abroad, sometimes you could buy a SIM card, maybe at the airport or at a booth outside the airport or some shady dude behind the airport, and you'd rip your phone apart. You'd have to use a little pin to get your SIM card out. And you put in a different SIM card, and that would give you access to local networks at a rate that was a lot better than international roaming charges. But it was difficult to do, and it wasn't always reliable, and Saley is so much better. Now, Saley is brought to you by the same professionals who brought you NordVPN, so you know that it is safe and reliable. And it's an eSIM, which means that it's going to come through an app. You don't have to tear your phone apart anymore to replace that postage stamp like you used to. You just go download Saley. You choose the country. They have competitive rates in about 150 different countries that are going to be better than your international roaming charges. You pick a country, you pick a plan, and bam, fast, reliable internet. It is literally that easy because it's through an app. If you go to another country, you don't have to upload it again. You just go choose another plan for another country. And if you have any difficulty doing that, then they have 24/7 customer service, which is really useful when you're on the road. And, if your phone happens to be one of those that can't use an eSIM, which can sometimes happen, you get a full refund. So you're really doing this without any risk. So don't be like me and get lost on the dusty back roads of Europe, unless I guess that's what you want to do. But in any case, make sure that you have safe and reliable internet with Saley. So go to saley.com/thehistoryguy. Choose a 1 gigabyte plan. Use the coupon code TheHistoryGuy. You'll get that gigabyte free. That's saley.com/thehistoryguy. Choose a 1 gigabyte plan. Use the code TheHistoryGuy. Get your free gigabyte of Saley. The Sacramento Host Breakfast, held annually in September since 1926, isn't typically a major news event outside of California. Its committee website writes that the annual event, attended by close to 1,000 civic and business leaders from throughout the state, offers decision-makers in California business, finance, government, education, and agriculture the opportunity to exchange views, establish and renew friendships, and create statewide atmospheres of goodwill and understanding at a common table. The breakfast is sponsored by the Sacramento Host Committee, made up of 30 Sacramento area business leaders and the California Chamber of Commerce. Columnist Dan Walters explained in the 2000 issue of the Sacramento Bee, originally the event was connected to the state fair, but eventually it acquired a life and a set of traditions all its own. One of those traditions was the inclusion of the governor of California, who would speak on what Walters called almost always a gubernatorial perspective on the state's economy. But, Walters writes, the tradition was broken 1 year. In 1974, 36-year-old Jerry Brown, son of former California Governor Pat Brown, had been elected governor. His election, replacing Governor Ronald Reagan, who was not running for re-election, represented a shift in California politics. 1974 represented the first year that California would have a Democratic governor and 2 Democratic U.S. senators since the Civil War. Walters writes that Brown was, shall we say, a bit different. Jerry Brown slept on a mattress in an almost empty apartment, dated a rock and roll singer, and refused to adhere to anything resembling a schedule. Thus, when invited to the annual host breakfast in 1975, for the first time in 49 years, the governor, as Walters described it, refused to make a commitment. Given the political climate of 1975, the new governor of California failing to RSVP for a breakfast wouldn't seem an important event, but it did have an interesting effect. The mostly Republican business executives in charge of the event, Walters writes, considered Brown's dithering to be an insult and decided to show him up by inviting the GOP president of the United States, Gerald Ford. Ford was anxious to accept the invitation. The first man to become U.S. president without being elected was seeking to win the office in his own right. He had announced his bid for the 1976 presidential election in July, and the invitation to the host breakfast offered an opportunity. It was also a rare opportunity for Sacramento, as journalist Jeff Braven noted in 1997. The state capital of California, despite a permanent population of bureaucrats and a transient class of politicians, rarely lured national figures away from the far larger media markets of San Francisco and Los Angeles. The Sacramento Union, billing itself as the oldest daily in the West, wrote on September 5th that President Ford, courting the West and enriching Republican campaign treasuries for 1976, arrived in Sacramento Thursday night, where he will address California business leaders. The Union writes that Brown, despite the spat that had brought Ford to the state, greeted Ford's plane as he arrived. And despite Brown's reputation, the Union writes that it was the president, a wide grin on his face, who kissed a young blonde on the cheek. She was Patty Goodell, a 24-year-old employee of Sacramento's McClellan Airport, and she had asked the president, "How about a kiss?" The Union reports that he responded, "Sure," and leaned over a rope and kissed Miss Goodell on the cheek. Patty Goodell wouldn't be the only pretty California girl to make the news during the president's visit. Lynette Fromm was 27 years old. Born in Santa Monica, Lynette had been called Linny as a child, and as a member of a girls' dance troupe called the Larriettes had performed on the Lawrence Welk Show and twice been invited to the White House. The family pronounced the name Froma, but by the time she was attending high school in Redondo Beach, Braven, author of a 1997 biography of her, wrote that she no longer bothered to correct people when they pronounced her surname with a silent E. She faced difficulties at the time. Her father was strict to the point of abusive, and she began drinking. In her junior year, her father kicked her out of the house. They briefly reconciled, but in 1967, when she was 18, he kicked her out for good. Destitute, she hitchhiked to Venice Beach, where by chance she met what Braven described as an unkempt, elf-like man in a cap, sporting a 2-day beard and a whiff of body odor. He looked, she thought, like a hobo with a touch of class. He described himself as the gardener because he took care of all the flower children, and they began chatting. The gardener, of course, Braven writes, was Charles Manson. A 2019 edition of The Mirror reported that the two became fast friends, and they traveled together with young people such as Mary Bruner and Susan Atkins. Eventually, the growing Manson family settled at the George Spahn Ranch, where the elderly owner, George Spahn, let them stay as long as they worked. Manson also ordered the women to sleep with the blind Spahn. Lynette Fromm apparently got her nickname Squeaky because of the sound she made when Spahn touched her. A 2024 edition of the Los Angeles Times wrote that she was one of Charles Manson's earliest disciples, a waif-like flower child who rhapsodized about LSD and redwood trees. Fromm was not charged with other members of the Manson family in the 1969 murders of Sharon Tate and Leo and Rosemary LaBianca, although she served a short sentence for contempt of court when she refused to testify in the case. The United Press reported in 1975 that during Manson's trial she mimicked his tactics, shaving her head and cutting an X into her forehead, to show that we had been crossed out of society. Manson was convicted and incarcerated at Folsom State Prison. The UPI reported that she had moved to Sacramento to be near Manson's prison. Miss Fromm was Manson's first convert, the report read, and was his voice on the outside, preaching his jumbled philosophy to reporters and trying to keep alive his cause years after he became a footnote to an era. But the reporter said she seemed the sanest of the Manson girls, said one reporter. Thus, she was in Sacramento on September 5th, the day that the spat between the Sacramento Host Breakfast Committee and Jerry Brown brought the president to Sacramento. That day, Braven wrote, Lynn dressed as she usually did, simply. She put on a collarless, scoop-neck flower print dress, kind of an old-fashioned look, low cut with its hem falling below the knee. But what to do with the gun? The gun was this M1911 Colt .45 caliber pistol. The United Press reported on September 9, 1975, that the gun was given to Fromm by Harold Borrow, a sugar daddy to members of the Manson family. In the trial, Borrow would claim that she had asked for the gun because she needed to protect herself from Manson's enemies in prison, who had connections on the outside and might come to hurt her. Borrow testified that he showed her how to pull the hammer back and fire it. The gun was described as a World War II keepsake that had been manufactured in 1911 and sold as surplus in 1913. Rex Davis of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was quoted by the United Press. The Colt 45 is not really a popular crime gun. It's rather large and not easily concealed. It would not be, I think, the choice of guns for women. Braven wrote that she had a leather holster for the gun, but if she wore it around her waist Wyatt Earp style, it would show through the dress. Instead, she used an elastic belt to tie the holster to her left calf. The president's visit included more than the host breakfast, but also interviews and a meeting with Governor Brown. And the details of the trip were published in area newspapers. The Union reported that Ford will return to the Senator Hotel after the address and then walk across the street to the Capitol for a 30-minute meeting with Brown. Fromm thus knew the path the president would take. The Los Angeles Times reported on the 6th that, clothed like a gypsy lady in red, Lynette Squeaky Fromm slithered around the gathering crowd and settled on a front-row stand in the shade of an orange tree. "Is this where the president is coming through?" she asked a policeman. Satisfied that it was, she turned to Karen Skelton, 14, and remarked, "Oh, it's a beautiful day." The paper reported that a witness said Squeaky's eyes looked glassy. She just didn't look normal, but then again, there are so many weirdos around. Braven wrote, on and on the president moved, acknowledging face after face she didn't recognize and would never see again. Suddenly, by a tree, something caught Ford's eye. In the sea of wide-colored, fair-haired well-wishers, a tiny elf in a flowing headdress, a blood-red gown amid the waves of earth-toned casual wear, floated towards him. He later testified that my first impression was that she wanted to come closer and extend, I thought at the time, a hand to shake or to say something to me. And as I stopped, I saw a hand come through the crowd on the first row, and that was the first active gesture that I saw. But in the hand, there was a gun. The Times reported that suddenly witnesses reported all the color just left his face. And the Sacramento Bee reported that she was subdued and disarmed after what several witnesses described as a metallic click. The United Press quoted Susan Folsom, a junior college student who witnessed the event, that she was about to shake hands with Ford as he greeted well-wishers in the Capitol Park when agents pounced on the Manson cultist and wrestled away the .45 caliber pistol. Secret Service agent Larry Bundorf was the one who disarmed Fromm. The United Press quoted him saying that Fromm said it didn't go off. Can you believe it? It didn't go off. Walters writes that she was handcuffed to a tree, shouting, "He's not a public servant! He's not a public servant!" Bundorf's hand was caught. Apparently he had been caught by the weapon's hammer, but that's not what had saved the president. While there were 4 cartridges in the weapon's magazine, none had been chambered. Bundorf later told the LA Times, "You pull the slide back and it chambers around. If she had had one in the chamber already, I don't think I would have made it. I think it would have gone through me and the president." Despite the attempt, Ford carried on. Jerry Ackerman of the Boston Globe reported in 1981, Ford, who had been only 2 feet away from Fromm, walked on into the California State House and met for 30 minutes with Governor Brown, without mentioning the incident until they were through talking business. "I thought I'd better get on with my day's schedule," Ford said later. Donald Heller, who prosecuted Fromm, recalled to the Sacramento Bee that Ford said that he wasn't scared. Certainly the attempt wasn't enough to keep Ford out of the state of California, which was expected to be a key state in the 1976 race. Fromm was still very much in the news on September 19th when the Associated Press reported that Ford, this time accompanied by his wife, will be back in California just 2 weeks after an alleged attempt was made on his life in Sacramento by Lynette Fromm. The trip would include several stops, including a round of golf at Pebble Beach, before the president would head to San Francisco on September 22nd to speak to a meeting of the AFL-CIO Building and Construction Trades Council, followed by a speech to the World Affairs Council. The Associated Press reported that 7 minutes before he delivered his address to the AFL-CIO, a young man was arrested outside the hotel where Ford was supposed to speak and booked on suspicion of threatening the life of the president. Agents said that the man, 24-year-old San Franciscan Ronald Carlo, had tried to deliver a threatening note to an employee of the hotel. However, they said the man was never near Ford and was not carrying a gun. But if the president seemed to have figuratively dodged a bullet, he would be doing so more literally later the same day. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Ford was leaving the St. Francis Hotel in Union Square, having finished his speech at the World Affairs Council. Among the crowd waiting to see the president was 44-year-old Sarah Jane Moore, an employee of the Hearst Foundation's Feed the Poor program called People in Need. The Associated Press reported that employees there described her as a strange woman, a very strange woman, and a very difficult person to work with. As Ford left the hotel, SF Gate reported in 2009, in a flash, 2 shots rang out. The first narrowly missed the 38th President of the United States, and the second was deflected by a bystander who grabbed at the arm of the shooter. 33-year-old Oliver Sipple hadn't originally intended to see the president, telling the Associated Press that he had been walking to Fisherman's Wharf when he saw the crowd and decided to stay. He told the Associated Press that he happened to be standing near Moore. She was there for an hour, and then the president came out, and he waved, and I started to clap for the president. And then I noticed a chrome-plated gun, and I screamed, "Gun!" as loud as I could, and grabbed her arm. I don't know when it went off. Next thing I know, there are police and Secret Service all over us. The first shot had flown just 5 inches from the president's head. The second, likely diverted by Sipple, struck another person in the crowd, 42-year-old taxi driver John Ludwig. Ludwig, a survivor of the Buchenwald concentration camp, survived the injury. Timothy Hedrick, a 25-year-old San Francisco police officer, was able to take the gun from Moore. When arrested, the Associated Press reported, she says it was a kind of a silly thing to do because she was going to be late picking up her 9-year-old boy at school. There have been numerous attempts to assassinate United States presidents, the most recent being this last July. But Moore and Fromm are the only women to have attempted to assassinate a United States president. And while the United Press noted that their lives bore little resemblance to each other, after September 1975, their lives followed a very similar path. They were both convicted of attempting to assassinate the President of the United States. They were both given life sentences. They would both, over the course of their sentence, manage brief escapes. And they would both eventually be released from prison. Moore in 2007 at the age of 77, and Fromm in 2009 at the age of 61. And both are, as of the airing of this episode, still alive today. Their motives were complex, but motivated by extremist politics that were perhaps indicative of the time. Ford's press secretary, Ron Nessen, noted that Ford was puzzled by these assassination attempts. But he said it was the 1970s, and it was California. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community and locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.